The day started like any other, with the usual chatter and rustling of papers in the classroom. It was early in the semester, and everyone was still adjusting to their new schedules, but there was a certain tension in the air today, a feeling that something big was coming. It was the kind of tension that made even the most confident students nervous. Today was the day of the math quiz. For most students, this wouldn't have been a big deal. They'd studied, they'd prepared, and they were ready. But not everyone felt that way. Some students, like one who sat at the back of the classroom, were already feeling a bit of dread. Math wasn't their favorite subject. In fact, it was a subject that often made them anxious, especially in this particular class. The teacher had a reputation for being tough. It wasn't that he was mean, far from it. He was just incredibly good at math, and his tests always felt like they were designed to push you to your limits. The problem wasn't just the difficulty of the problems. It was that the teacher had this way of making the simplest concepts seem complicated. His tests were unpredictable, and every student knew it. You couldn't just rely on memorizing formulas or plugging numbers into equations. You had to understand the why behind everything. This was exactly what made the quiz so intimidating. It was never just about finding the right answer. It was about proving you understood why that answer worked, and how to find it in the first place. On this particular day, the teacher walked in with his usual quiet confidence, his glasses perched at the edge of his nose as he looked out over the class. His eyes scanned the room, making sure everyone was seated and ready. His presence was enough to make most students sit up straighter in their chairs. He didn't need to say much for everyone to know. The quiz was coming. "All right," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "You'll have 40 minutes to complete the quiz. Don't rush. Take your time. Just make sure you show your work." With that, he handed out the papers and returned to his desk, leaving the students to face the dreaded questions. The quiz wasn't long, but it felt long. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the background as the minutes slipped away, and every student bent their head over their paper, furiously scribbling answers. The questions on the quiz were challenging, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that one question that stood out from the rest. It wasn't even the hardest question in terms of calculations. It was a problem that seemed almost too simple, a question about algebra, something basic that should have been easy for anyone who'd studied the material. But for some reason, when the student read it, their brain started to overthink. The question was something along the lines of simplifying an equation. Simple, right? But the way it was worded threw them off. There was something about it that didn't feel right. It was like a little puzzle that needed to be solved, and the student wasn't sure if the question was actually as easy as it seemed, or if the teacher was trying to trick them into making a mistake. So, the student did what they thought was the clever thing to do. They overcomplicated it. Instead of sticking to the standard steps they'd learned in class, they started looking for a deeper meaning in the problem, thinking maybe it was a trick question. What if the teacher was testing their ability to spot an error or a hidden trick? Maybe the problem wasn't meant to be solved in the normal way. Maybe it was a test of logic, or maybe the answer was meant to be something unexpected. The more they thought about it, the more confused they became. But instead of asking for clarification or moving on, they decided to trust their gut. They wrote down the answer they thought was right, sure that they were the only one who'd spotted the hidden trick in the question. The rest of the quiz passed in a blur. The student finished quickly, trying to focus on the other problems. The questions that seemed straightforward felt like a relief after that one tricky problem. They checked over their answers, and despite a lingering feeling that they might have missed something, they submitted their paper with a sense of satisfaction. It wasn't until the next day, when the teacher handed back the graded quizzes, that the student realized something was wrong. When the quiz was returned, the student's heart skipped a beat. The grades were good for everything except for that one question. That one problem that had seemed like such a puzzle. Next to the problem, the teacher had written a single line. "See me after class," confusion set in. Why would the teacher ask to speak with them about this one problem? Had they made a mistake? The student was sure they hadn't. After all, they had spotted the trick, right? They had figured out what the teacher was really asking. Or so they thought. The rest of the class felt like it moved in slow motion. The student couldn't focus on anything the teacher was saying. All they could think about was that note. "See me after class." They could feel the eyes of their classmates on them, but they couldn't bring themselves to care. They didn't want to admit it, but they were nervous. They had no idea what was coming. Finally, when the bell rang, the student walked up to the teacher's desk, trying to act calm, even though their stomach was in knots. The teacher looked up from his papers as they approached. There was no scolding look, no disappointment in his eyes. Instead, he just nodded and motioned for the student to sit down. "About that question," the teacher started, his voice even. "You did something interesting there." The student nodded, relieved that the conversation was starting off casually. They figured they might be able to explain their logic, show the teacher that they had figured out the problem in a new way. "I thought it was a trick," the student said, trying to sound confident. "So I worked through it differently than the rest of the problems." The teacher raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "I see. And what made you think it was a trick?" The student hesitated for a moment before explaining their thought process. They talked about how the question felt too simple, too straightforward to be real. How they assumed there had to be something hidden within the question that needed to be uncovered. The teacher listened patiently, not interrupting. When the student finished explaining, he leaned back in his chair and gave a small smile. "You're not wrong to question things," he said, "but in this case you overthought it." The student blinked, confused. "Overthought it?" The teacher nodded. "Yes, the problem was meant to be solved in the way we've been practicing. There was no trick, no hidden secret. It was just a straightforward question. But instead of using the method you've learned, you created your own, more complicated way of solving it." The student felt a mix of embarrassment and confusion. How had they missed something so simple? "It's easy to get caught up in thinking there's always a catch," the teacher continued. "But sometimes the answer is just right in front of you, waiting to be found. You don't need to complicate it." The student sat quietly, taking in the teacher's words. It was humbling, but also eye-opening. They had spent so much time trying to find a trick that they'd missed the simplest solution. The next day, after the quiz was handed back, the classroom felt different. The tension from the previous day had shifted. Students were talking, exchanging their quiz scores, and some even bragging about how well they had done. For most, the math quiz was over, just another test to get through. But for one student, the day felt heavier. The weight of that note from the teacher was still hanging over their head. "See me after class." The words replayed over and over in the student's mind. What did the teacher want to talk about? Was the answer wrong? Had they made a mistake? More importantly, how had they made that mistake? During class, the student tried to focus, but it was impossible. The other students around them were working through problems, laughing and joking, but everything felt distant. All the while, their mind kept drifting back to the moment they had received their graded quiz. The teacher's face had been calm when he handed it back. He hadn't looked disappointed, but he hadn't looked impressed either. The note on that one question had felt like a mystery, one they were desperate to solve. The student had convinced themselves that they were right, that they'd figured out something the teacher hadn't intended, that they had cracked the code of the problem. But what if they were wrong? What if they had completely misunderstood everything? What if the teacher was about to explain something that would make them feel foolish? The bell rang, signaling the end of the class. Everyone packed up their things quickly and headed out the door, laughing and talking about their plans for the weekend. But the students stayed behind, sitting still in their seat for a moment, staring at the empty desk in front of them. The teacher was still at his desk, writing something down. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the student stood up and walked slowly toward the teacher's desk. The teacher didn't look up immediately. There was a moment of silence as the student stood there, unsure of what to say. When the teacher finally did look up, he gave a small smile, as though he had been expecting this. "You wanted to talk about the quiz?" he asked calmly, setting his pen down. The student nodded, trying to mask their nervousness with a forced smile. "Yeah, I just wanted to ask about that one question," they began, their voice shaky. "I thought I had figured it out. I thought maybe it was a trick or something. I didn't think it was supposed to be solved the usual way." The teacher leaned back in his chair and folded his arms across his chest, listening intently. "I see. You thought it was a trick." The student nodded again, explaining how they had felt that something about the problem seemed too easy, almost like the teacher was testing their ability to spot a hidden error. "So I thought maybe the problem was trying to make us second-guess the simple solution," the student continued. "I thought the answer had to be something more complicated. The teacher didn't interrupt, just listened carefully. After a moment of silence, he asked, "What do you think you missed?" The student hesitated. They had been so sure of their answer, so confident that they had cracked the code. I think I overcomplicated it," they said finally, the words coming slowly. "I should have just solved it the way you taught us." The teacher nodded. Sometimes we get so caught up in thinking there's a trick, we miss the simplest answer right in front of us. It's an easy mistake to make. The student felt a knot tighten in their stomach. The feeling of being wrong wasn't new, it happened. But this time it stung a little more. It wasn't just a simple mistake. It was the fact that they had misjudged the problem entirely. They had convinced themselves that they knew better, that they could outsmart the quiz, and in doing so they had missed the point of the question altogether. "I thought it was a test of logic, you know," the student said, looking down at the desk. "Like maybe you were seeing if we could catch something that didn't make sense in the problem." "That's an interesting thought," the teacher replied. "But sometimes logic means recognizing when something is exactly as it seems. The trick isn't in finding something hidden. It's in understanding that the answer can often be right there, without needing to look for something more complex." The student nodded slowly, absorbing the teacher's words. There was no trick. There was no hidden secret. The answer had been right in front of them the entire time. They had let their overthinking get in the way of what should have been a simple solution. But the more the student thought about it, the more they realized something important. The teacher wasn't just teaching math, he was teaching them how to think. The lesson wasn't just about solving equations, it was about the mindset that comes with solving problems. It was about approaching things with a clear head, not clouding their judgment by overanalyzing every detail. "You don't always need to make things harder than they are," the teacher said, his tone softening a little. "Sometimes the best thing you can do is take a step back, trust the process, and focus on what you know." The student let the words sink in. The realization was gradual but powerful. It wasn't just about math. It was about how they approached challenges in general. Life often felt like a series of puzzles, and it was easy to get lost in the complexity. But the teacher's words were a reminder that sometimes the best solutions came from simplicity and clarity of thought. As the conversation ended, the teacher smiled again. "You're a smart student," he said, "and I know you'll get it next time. Don't let one mistake make you doubt your abilities." The student stood up, feeling a sense of relief, though they were still embarrassed by their earlier mistake. But something had shifted inside them. They weren't just walking away from the conversation with a better understanding of math. They were walking away with a better understanding of how to handle their own thoughts and doubts. "Thanks. I'll definitely take that into account," the student replied. Feeling a little lighter, the teacher nodded. "You're welcome. Just remember, don't get too caught up in trying to find answers that aren't there. The most straightforward path is often the best one." As the student walked out of the classroom, they felt a mixture of embarrassment and gratitude. They had made a mistake, sure, but that mistake was a lesson in itself. It was a lesson about trusting the process, about not overthinking things, and about the importance of stepping back when things didn't make sense. The more the student reflected on the conversation with the teacher, the more they realized that math was about more than just numbers and equations. It was about problem solving. And more importantly, it was about knowing when to simplify things and not get lost in unnecessary complexity. The student had learned something valuable, not just for the next quiz, but for life. And as for the teacher, they weren't just a math genius who could explain every concept in detail. They were a guide, a mentor, helping the student not only understand the material, but also understand themselves a little better. For the student, this was the beginning of a new perspective, not just in math, but in how they approached every challenge they faced. The days after that conversation felt different. The weight of the mistake still lingered in the back of the student's mind, but something had shifted. It wasn't just about math anymore. It was about the way they approached learning and challenges in general. The teacher's words had given them a new perspective. Sometimes, the answer doesn't need to be complicated, and sometimes, the solution is right there in front of you. But despite this newfound understanding, math still wasn't easy. It wasn't like everything suddenly clicked into place and the student could breeze through every problem. They were still struggling with certain concepts, especially when it came to more complex equations. Some problems just didn't make sense no matter how many times they tried. The student had a few days to reflect on everything before the next round of homework came. The math assignments were piling up, and with every new set of problems they could feel their confidence slipping a little. The simple concepts, the ones that had seemed so clear after the conversation with the teacher, started feeling fuzzy again. They had a sense of the general idea, but when it came down to the actual practice, actually solving the problems, they still felt lost. It was during one of these difficult study sessions, when the student was sitting at their desk late in the evening, staring at a particularly tricky set of equations, that something unexpected happened. The student was trying to work through a problem that involved a complex set of variables, something they had gone over in class but just couldn't quite grasp. They were close to giving up for the night when they heard a quiet knock on their door. They got up a little confused and opened the door to find someone standing in the hallway. It was another student from class, someone they had seen around but hadn't really spoken to. This student was always quiet, always kept to themselves. They were a bit of a mystery to most of the class. Silent, reserved, but consistently the top performer in math. "Hey," the other student said in a soft voice. "I saw you struggling with the homework in class today. Would you like some help? I can walk you through it." The student blinked, surprised. They hadn't expected anyone to offer help, especially not this student who hardly ever spoke in class. It was almost like they had read the student's mind, seeing their frustration, sensing their doubts. The offer was unexpected, but the student was grateful for it. Sure," the student replied, feeling a little embarrassed but also relieved. "I could really use some help." The two of them sat down at the desk, and the student who had offered help took a look at the problem. It was the same one that had been giving the student trouble all evening. Without saying much, the student started walking them through the steps, explaining the process in a calm, clear manner. The way they spoke was so simple yet so precise. There was no rush, no frustration, just an easy, steady rhythm to their explanation. The more they went over the steps, the clearer things started to become. The second student broke the problem down into manageable chunks, explaining each step as they went along. They didn't just tell the student the answer, though. They made sure the student understood why each step mattered and how everything fit together. At first, the student had felt overwhelmed. But now, as the problem began to make sense, something else started to shift. The anxiety that had been swirling around in their chest began to melt away. They realized that this wasn't just about memorizing steps or formulas. It was about understanding how everything connected, how one piece of the puzzle fit with the next. "That makes sense now," the student said, a small smile starting to form on their face. "I guess I just needed to slow down and see it step by step." The other student nodded, a slight smile appearing as well. "Yeah, sometimes you just need someone to show you the way. It's easy to get caught up in the big picture and forget the little details." It was simple advice, but it stuck with the student. It wasn't just about rushing to the end goal or getting the answer quickly. It was about taking your time, breaking things down, and making sure you understood the process. This was the lesson that had been missing all along. The student felt a strange sense of relief after that session. The puzzle, once unsolvable, now seemed so much more manageable. They realized that math wasn't a series of isolated problems to be solved. It was a process, a way of thinking, of taking things step by step, without getting caught up in the panic of making mistakes. Over the next few weeks, the student began to change the way they approached their math homework. Instead of panicking when a problem seemed difficult, they slowed down and tried to think through it logically, just like the other student had shown them. They broke down the problems into smaller parts, and when they got stuck, they took a deep breath and reminded themselves to focus on one thing at a time. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of frustration, still moments when the student would feel lost and confused. But now there was a little more patience, a little more confidence, and when they did get stuck, they knew where to turn. The quiet student who had helped them was always there to lend a hand, always ready to walk them through a problem with calm reassurance. The student realized that they had been missing something important all along, not just about math, but about life. They had been rushing too much, always trying to find the answer as quickly as possible, always afraid of getting things wrong. But now they saw that it wasn't about the end result. It was about the journey, about the process, and about how you handled the challenges along the way. As the weeks passed, the students' understanding of math grew deeper. They began to see patterns where they hadn't seen them before. They were making fewer mistakes, solving more problems on their own, and feeling more confident in their ability to tackle new challenges. And it wasn't just the math that had improved. The student was learning something even more valuable. They were learning how to be patient with themselves, how to approach problems with clarity instead of fear, and how to rely on others for help when needed. It was a lesson that would stay with them long after the math homework was done. There was something else too, something about the way the quiet student helped them that made them realize something even deeper. The way that student had offered to help without expecting anything in return had opened the student's eyes. They hadn't just given them the answer. They had shown them a better way to think, a better way to approach not just math but life itself. The student was beginning to see that sometimes the most important lessons aren't learned from textbooks or exams. Sometimes the best lessons come from the people around us, from those who take the time to help, to teach, and to show us that we're capable of more than we think. And now, the student wasn't just learning math. They were learning how to trust the process, how to take things step by step, and how to rely on others for support when things got tough. As the weeks passed, the students' progress in math began to show. They weren't getting everything perfect, but they were getting better. More importantly, they were starting to enjoy the challenge of solving problems. The anxiety that used to make math feel like a mountain to climb had started to fade, replaced with a new sense of curiosity and determination. The feeling of breaking through a tough problem, of finally understanding a concept that had once seemed impossible, was becoming addictive. But the journey wasn't always smooth. There were still moments of doubt. Every now and then, when a particularly tricky equation would pop up, the student would find themselves feeling that familiar frustration. Sometimes the steps wouldn't add up. Sometimes the numbers wouldn't make sense. Sometimes the answers still seemed just out of reach. It was during one of those moments, when the student was stuck on a particularly difficult problem, that they remembered something important. The quiet classmate. The one who had helped them that first night, breaking down the steps so simply, so clearly. Without thinking twice, the student grabbed their phone and sent a quick message. "Hey, I'm stuck on this problem. Could you help me out?" It wasn't long before the reply came. "Sure, I'll come over in a bit." The student smiled at the screen, feeling a sense of relief. They'd learned not to hesitate when it came to asking for help anymore. It had taken time to get over the feeling of embarrassment or pride that kept them from asking others for assistance. But now, they knew it was okay. They had learned that everyone needed help sometimes, and that asking for it was a sign of strength, not weakness. When the classmate arrived, they wasted no time in getting down to business. Without any fuss, they looked at the problem, and within a few minutes they had explained it in the same clear step-by-step way that had worked before. But this time something felt different. The student wasn't just following along. They were starting to see patterns, to understand the reasoning behind each step in a deeper way. As the classmate finished explaining, the student hesitated. "I think I get it," they said, looking at the equation in front of them. "But what if I did it this way instead?" The classmate's eyebrows raised slightly. "Let me see." The student went through the steps they had in mind, explaining their reasoning as they worked through it. There were a few moments of uncertainty, but the classmate didn't interrupt. Instead, they waited patiently, watching as the student worked through their own thought process. When the student finished, they looked up, hoping for approval. The classmate thought for a moment before nodding. "That's actually a good way to look at it," they said. "You've got the right idea. You just need to tweak one small part to make sure it works all the way through." The student's heart lifted. It felt incredible to have found a solution on their own. Even if it wasn't perfect, it was a step forward. And that's what mattered. "Thanks," the student said, smiling. "I wouldn't have gotten there without you." The classmate shrugged, giving a small smile in return. "I didn't really do much. You figured it out on your own. That's the whole point, right?" It was a quiet compliment, but it meant a lot. The student had never really thought of themselves as someone who could solve complex problems on their own. They had always been the one to rely on others for answers, afraid that they'd never be able to find the solutions themselves. But now something had changed. It wasn't just about getting the right answer. It was about the process of figuring things out step by step. It was about learning to trust their own abilities. As the classmate left, the student sat at their desk for a few moments, reflecting on how far they had come. They hadn't solved every problem, but they had learned how to handle the frustration, how to ask for help when needed, and most importantly, how to think through problems on their own. The next few weeks felt different. The student no longer dreaded math homework. Instead, they started to approach it with a new sense of curiosity and determination. When they came across a problem that seemed too tough, they didn't panic. They broke it down. They reminded themselves to be patient, and when they got stuck, they asked for help. Whether it was the quiet classmate or the teacher, they were no longer afraid to lean on others. Their grades began to improve, but even more than that, their confidence grew. The student started to realize that math wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't about getting every question right or having all the answers from the start. It was about the journey, the process of figuring things out and learning from each mistake along the way. It was about being persistent, even when things felt difficult. Then came the day of the final exam. It loomed over the classroom like a shadow, a reminder of all the work still to be done. The student had been studying for weeks, but there was still that feeling of uncertainty. Would all the hours of practice be enough? Would they really be able to apply everything they had learned? The morning of the exam, the student sat at their desk feeling a mix of nerves and excitement. It was the culmination of everything they had worked for, the mistakes, the lessons, the breakthroughs. It felt like the final test, not just of math, but of everything they had learned about themselves. When the test was handed out, the student took a deep breath. There were moments of panic, of confusion, but instead of freezing up like they would have before, they started working through the problems, one at a time, step by step, breaking each problem down. They could feel the years of self-doubt melting away, replaced with a quiet confidence that grew with each correct answer. There was one moment, near the end of the exam, when the student found themselves stuck on a problem they hadn't expected. For a brief second, panic bubbled up inside of them. But then they remembered what the quiet classmate had said. Sometimes, you just need to slow down and see it step by step. They took a deep breath and re-examined the question. After a few moments of focused thinking, they saw the solution. When the exam ended, the student handed in their paper with a sense of accomplishment. It wasn't just about the grade they would get. It was about the journey they had taken, about how much they had grown, not just as a student, but as a person. A few days later, when the exam results came back, the student was pleasantly surprised to see that they had passed. More than passed, actually. They had done better than they expected. But the real victory wasn't in the grade. It was in how they had tackled the challenges along the way, how they had learned to be patient, to ask for help, to trust their own abilities, and most importantly, to keep going even when things felt hard. Looking back, the student realized that the real lesson wasn't just in solving math problems. It was in learning how to deal with life's challenges, step by step. With patience and perseverance, and maybe, just maybe, they had learned that the true measure of success wasn't in the answers they found, but in the questions they were willing to ask and the journey they were willing to take.